All right, let's dive into a really fascinating piece of history. When the major European powers came to the Americas, they didn't just show up with the same game plan. In fact, they had radically different ideas about what they were doing. So today, we're going to break down the playbooks for Spain, France, the Netherlands, and England.
I mean, think about it. You've got 4 empires, all landing on the same massive continent, but each one operates with a completely different strategy. So the big question we're tackling is, why? What was driving these incredibly distinct approaches to colonization?
So, first up, Spain. They were the first to really establish a massive empire here. And their whole model really can be boiled down to just 2 words: conquest and control. They came to dominate, to subjugate, and to completely reshape the Americas in their own image.
Now, to really get the Spanish approach, you have to remember where they were coming from. They had just spent centuries in a military campaign called the Reconquista, taking back their homeland. So they were basically a society primed for conquest. When they got to the Americas, their mission was crystal clear: wealth extraction. They were there for gold and silver, and they planned to get it through huge mining operations and large-scale farming. And they definitely weren't planning on doing the hard labor themselves.
And the main tool they used for this was a system called the encomienda. Now, this is a crucial point. This wasn't a grant of land, it was a grant of people. The Spanish crown literally gave colonists the right to demand forced labor from entire Native American communities.
But here's the thing, that system started to fall apart. Tragically, European diseases just devastated the native populations. And the people who did survive, well, they knew the land way too well to be easily controlled. So as the encomienda system failed, the Spanish made a horrific and systematic shift. They began to replace that labor source with enslaved people brought forcibly from Africa.
And it wasn't just about the economy. They also built this incredibly rigid social structure called the casta system. You can think of it as a massive project of social engineering. It was a strict hierarchy based entirely on your racial ancestry, and it was designed to keep people born in Spain right at the very top of the pyramid.
And of course, you can't talk about Spain without talking about religion. That gold God and glory motto, they took the God part very seriously. They set up this huge network of missions to convert indigenous people to Christianity. But the results were, well, they were really complex. Some people converted, for sure, but others resisted, sometimes violently, like in the Pueblo Revolt. And many others did something really clever. They blended their own spiritual traditions with Catholic practices, creating whole new forms of faith.
Okay, so that's Spain. Now let's completely switch gears and look at the French and the Dutch. We can kind of group them together because their approach was a world away from Spain's. It wasn't about conquest, it was all about building trade alliances.
The big difference here is that they didn't send huge waves of settlers, and that was on purpose. France, for example, had its own problems back home with religious wars, so they couldn't really send a lot of people over. Their goal wasn't to take over and rule. It was to build relationships for one main reason: trade. They were after valuable goods, especially furs, that they could ship back to Europe.
And this is where we see a really interesting, subtle split between the two. The French strategy, it was all about kinship. They actually used intermarriage to weave themselves into the fabric of Native American life and get access to those trade networks. But the Dutch, for them, it was just pure commerce. Business was business.
So if we zoom in on the French, their first goal wasn't even to colonize North America. They were looking for a shortcut, a water route to Asia. When that didn't pan out, they focused on what the land did have to offer: fish and incredibly valuable furs. Since they had so few colonists, their whole strategy depended on a network of trading posts and, most importantly, on forming family bonds. By marrying into tribes like the Ojibwe, they created a real partnership, a sort of middle ground of cultural and economic exchange. The Dutch also started out looking for that magical route to Asia. After Henry Hudson's voyage gave them a claim, they founded New Amsterdam, and it quickly turned into this buzzing hub of commerce that attracted people from all over. The Dutch were basically the pioneers of global capitalism, and they brought that same bottom-line focus to their colony. And unlike the Spanish, they had pretty much zero interest in converting Native Americans. For the Dutch, it was all about the deal.
And that brings us to our last power, England. And boy, were they different. Their colonial model wasn't about a few soldiers or traders. It was defined by a flood of settlers, men, women, entire families, all coming over with the plan to stay for good.
So why did so many English people make the dangerous journey across the Atlantic? Well, their reasons were all over the map. You had people hoping to climb the social ladder, others just looking for land and a chance to make a living. You had religious groups like the Puritans and Quakers who were running from persecution. And you had tons of people who were just trying to escape the terrible economic situation in England at the time.
Okay, so you have all these families showing up. What do? They farm. The entire English colonial economy was built on agriculture, and farming on that scale requires one thing above all else: land. Lots and lots of land, which of course was taken from Native Americans.
And this gets to maybe the biggest difference in how they dealt with the native population. Spain's model was one of incorporation. They subjugated Native Americans, yes, but they pulled them into their society, even if it was at the very bottom. The English model was the opposite. It was a model of expulsion. They wanted to live separately, and as their farms and towns expanded, they just pushed native communities further and further away.
So there you have it, 3 completely different models: Spain's conquest, the French and Dutch focus on trade, and England's wave of settlement. Let's pull all these threads together now and see how these choices set the stage for the future of the entire continent.
When you lay it all out like this, the patterns just jump right out at you, don't they? Spain's motivation for wealth extraction led directly to a system of conquest and subjugation. The French and Dutch focus on trade led to very different relationships based on partnership or pure business. And England's motivation, finding new homes for tons of settlers, led almost inevitably to a policy of separation and expulsion. Each path was a direct result of their original goal.
These weren't just small tweaks in colonial policy. They created fundamentally different societies from the very beginning. They put the entire continent on radically different paths. And that really leaves us with one last big question to think about. What legacies of these founding strategies can we still see playing out all around us in the Americas today?